Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to OpEd.tv. In 1906, Theodore Roosevelt was president, San Francisco was all but destroyed in an earthquake, and in an episode we're about to discuss, a 103-pound, 4'11" black African named Ota Benga was exhibited in a cage, right along with the animals, in the monkey house of the Bronx Zoo. Yes, this man, this human being, was put on display for the amusement of visitors to the zoo. And the visitors loved it. They came by the tens of thousands to laugh and hoot and to mock the poor man. Ota Benga was a sensation. Pamela Newkirk, a journalism professor at NYU, has chronicled this shamefully grotesque story in her new book, Spectacle: The Astonishing Life of Ota Benga. We'll talk about this episode and what it meant then, as well as the insights it offers us about race relations today. Pamela, welcome.
Thank you.
Congratulations on your new book. It is terrific.
Thank you.
So why don't you start by telling us just who Ota Benga was? Where did he come from, and how did he get to the United States?
Well, in 1903, Samuel Werner, who was a South Carolinian who had been a former missionary, was commissioned by the St. Louis World's Fair organizers to go to the Congo to bring back so-called pygmies, diminutive people who dwelled in the forest, who were believed at the time to be the least civilized human beings. So Samuel Werner went to the Congo in 1904. He brought back these so-called pygmies, and Ota Benga was one of them.
What was the whole point? What did they plan to do with these folks?
They planned to map human progress from the lowest to the highest civilizations, with Africans and specifically pygmies alleged to be the least civilized, and Europeans considered the most. And so they had tens of thousands of people displayed across the fairgrounds. They brought back Inuit, Eskimos, Japanese, Chinese. They had an Irish village. There was a Patagonian village. It was, and this was purported to be science. Ota Benga was part of the anthropological exhibit at the fair. And this was
a spectacular success.
Millions.
People loved it, right?
Millions of people.
And you point out in the book, I mean, the exhibition was essentially a celebration of American imperialism.
Oh, no
right?
question.
Yeah.
No question.
So how did Ota Benga get from St. Louis to the Bronx?
Yeah, so he was taken back along with the rest of the Congo delegation, and he was then brought back by Werner, who by then tried to make his name as a scientist and as an explorer. So he brought Ota Benga back to the United States, as he had brought back other Congolese people earlier, one who had died in a stampede. But he trafficked in human beings to make money, basically. He wrote articles for some of the most prominent magazines of the time, The Atlantic and Harper's, and he wrote about people who he claimed were spectacle specimens,
right.
People that you study.
So you put everything in the context of the times, and so it's a much larger story than just the life of Ota Benga, as fascinating as that was. So this was a time when King Leopold II of Belgium had essentially absolute control over the Congo. So talk about what conditions were like for the Africans during that period. So
by the time that Ota Benga was brought here, the controversy over Leopold's reign was beginning to really reach, the mass public. People like Mark Twain wrote about Leopold's just brutal reign over these people who were enslaved, tortured, maimed, hands cut off, forced to work to gather rubber and other minerals that were then sold that enriched his empire. So Ota Benga was caught up in this atrocity. And so Samuel Werner, when he went to the Congo, he went heavily armed. So anyone who could even think of Ota Benga as complicit in his exploitation, you would only have to look at how Werner himself described how he went to the Congo, the kind of ammunition that he took with him. He even suggested at one point maybe bringing a cannon that would make it easier to execute his mission. So this was a brutal force by which he brought these human beings over to the United States, and by which he brought Ota Benga twice to the United States.
So Ota Benga essentially is trapped between this horrendous rule of the Belgians in the Congo,
right,
and this fellow who's going to exploit him and other so-called pygmies in taking them back to the United States.
Right, and he depicted Ota Benga in articles and lectures that he gave across the country as a savage, as a cannibal. None of this was true, but because Ota Benga had teeth that were kind of chipped into like a V shape, which was a conceit that was very popular across the Congo.
It was a decorative conceit.
It's decorative. It was like ear piercing, and because he had those teeth, it made it easier for Werner to pass him off as a cannibal and as a savage. So the story became
that these chipped, or as they would say, filed teeth were used to eat human flesh.
Exactly.
All right, so what was the point of bringing him to the Bronx, and how did he end up in the zoo?
Well, the point was for Werner, he was trying to make his way as a scientist, as an important man.
Did he have any
the city.
Scientific credentials?
He had no scientific credentials. He did have a degree from what is now the University of South Carolina, and but he was not a scientist. But he was used by a lot of scientists to kind of support many of the theories that were quite common at the time. Some of the most prominent scientists, the most eminent men of New York City, were also eugenicists, people who believed that, Africans were midway between a orangutan and a human being. So he really was a man for his time.
Many people just absolutely believe that black people were subhuman, that they had a ladder of the races.
Exactly.
Northern European whites were up at the top,
right,
and blacks would be down at the bottom.
Precisely.
And Ota Benga was supposed to illustrate this.
Exactly, and it was a time when many people were hell-bent on finding the missing link, and so could Ota Benga be that missing link?
It's actually, even after reading the book, it's hard to grasp that
it is.
These folks said, yes, we're going to use him as an exhibit in the zoo. And do you have a sense of how the decision was made to actually put him in a cage? And he was in a cage literally with an orangutan.
Yes, I think it happened to William Hornaday, who was the zoo director, who was also the founder of the National Zoo in Washington, D.C.
And who hated that it was called the Bronx Zoo.
Well, hated. Oh, my God. It was the New York Zoological Gardens. These were high-minded people, right? But Samuel Werner was actually trying to sell a chimpanzee. He needed money. He was out of money. The sheriff was after him for bouncing checks in New York.
This esteemed scientist.
Yeah, right. So he was trying to raise money to get back to South Carolina. And anyway, he had Ota Benga, and he had 2 chimpanzees. One was sick and dying. He was able to sell one to the zoo, but when they saw Ota Benga, they said, oh, we like him too. Samuel Werner could not afford to keep Ota Benga at that time, so he sort of dropped him off at the zoo. And what happened behind closed doors cannot be known for sure, but we do know that he ended up an exhibit in a cage with a sign in the Bronx Zoo.
So Hornaday, who was the head of the zoo, he was a respected figure at the time.
Oh, yes.
And he's the one.
He was probably the most prominent zoologist in this country and one of the most prominent in the world.
And once again, they put him in a cage, but they also passed him off as a savage, as a cannibal, right?
Yeah, well, what they did is they didn't actually say that, so they put him in a cage in the monkey house. And the second day of the exhibit, Hornaday littered the cage with bones, which would suggest cannibalism, right? So he never said it, but there were the bones, right? And there was Ota Benga, and there was an orangutan in the cage with him.
And so what was the, this is New York City. I mean, I know that it was in the early part of the 20th century.
The progressive era.
New York City,
oh my gosh, yes.
So what was the reaction to this spectacle?
He was a great sensation. As you suggested at the top of the show, people came by the thousands, by the tens of thousands. On one day alone, 40,000 people went to the Bronx Zoo, and most of them, if not all of them, went to the monkey house to see Ota Benga. He made headlines not only in New York City. The New York Times probably wrote the first headline, "Bushman shares a cave with Bronx Park apes." And after that, there were sensational and sensationalized headlines across the country, L.A., Chicago. Headlines turned up in London, in Paris. I mean, he was a global sensation, not just a New York City sensation.
So there are photos of Ota Benga. Describe him. He was a small person. Do we have a sense of how old he was?
Well, they said that the sign on the cage said that he was 23, that he had been twice married, that he had children. But if you look at that picture of Ota Benga, taken 2 years before he was exhibited, he's a child. I mean, it's pretty clear that he's a child. Near the end of his life, 10 years later, he told someone that he was 13 when he was captured in the Congo, which would have made him 15 when he was at the zoo.
And he looks like, in the photos, he looks like a kid who's 15 years old or so.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So now he was not just a passive individual accepting all of this derisiveness and the humiliation and stuff. There were times when he became angry. There were even times when he revolted. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, you know, there was resistance, clear signs of resistance, and because he had no voice, because he left no papers, the people who exploited him got the last word on him, and they suggested that he was complicit, that he was helping out with the animals. But we do know, based on letters exchanged between the zoological officials and Samuel Werner, that he had become really hard to handle, that he tried to fight when they tried to put him in the cage. Imagine that.
Yeah, exactly. I was just going to say, why would he want to do that?
Yeah, and, you know, he's becoming uncontrollable. We cannot handle him. So the letters became more and more urgent. You know, he has to be taken away because the boy has become unmanageable.
It just feeds into the idea that he was a savage.
Exactly.
So how did he finally get to leave the zoo?
Well, thanks in part to a minister, a very prominent minister of his time, Reverend Robert Stewart MacArthur, a white Canadian Baptist minister at Calvary Baptist Church on 57th Street, which is still there. He's the first one who raised objections to the exhibit, and then he kind of rallied the black ministers around the cause, and then they picked up the cause.
These are black ministers in New York?
In New York City, right. Yeah. And then finally, ministers around the country protested. But that's what ultimately, between the protest and also Ota Benga's resistance, I think the two together resulted in him, after almost a month, being released to an orphanage for colored children.
And that's here in New York?
In Brooklyn, right. Weeksville.
So then what happened? Because he didn't go back to Africa.
He never made it back to Africa. He very badly wanted to go back home. Samuel Werner, by then, a year later, was commissioned by New York bankers to go back to the Congo, this time to set up a post where he could collect. People were trying to make money. I mean,
this is his career, just going to Africa and exploiting whatever he could.
Exactly. And so he had offered Ota Benga a trip back with him, but by now Ota Benga's like, no.
He wanted no part of Werner.
He wanted no part of Samuel Werner. But he did work on a farm, and he tried to save money to make his way back home. The war broke out. It was not going to be easy. World War I. And so for years he was working, he was trying to save money. He finally ended up in Lynchburg, Virginia, where he was taken in by the African-American community there. First, he attended classes at a seminary and did odd jobs, but he wanted to go home. He made it very clear he wanted to go home.
So how long was he in Virginia?
Well, he went to Virginia the last time in 1910, and he was there until the end of his life, 1916.
The end of his life came about how?
Pretty tragically, he took his own life.
Do you have a sense that, it's very difficult to imagine what it must have been like for a person that young to be set up in this completely alien environment.
Right.
You don't have command of the language. You have no idea whom you can trust or anything like that.
Or where your family is. Are they okay?
And you want to go back home, but you can't.
And you can't, right.
So the idea that he would become profoundly depressed is not surprising at all.
No.
So he took his own life.
Yes.
How did he do that?
He found a gun and he shot himself in the heart.
And that was it. And he was buried in Virginia?
He was buried. He had a proper funeral and burial in Virginia. He was a beloved figure of the Lynchburg community.
And he was, you would say, roughly how old when he died?
Well, if he was 15 when he was at the Bronx Zoo, that would have made him like 25 then.
Now, your book is a case study in the idea that black lives don't matter. And so give us a sense of just how intense and pervasive racism in the United States was in the early part of the 20th
Yeah, well,
century.
I mean, this case of Ota Benga, this idea of race in African American lives or African lives, I mean, as inferior was embedded in science. It was embedded in, history books and popular culture, media, newspapers. African Americans were routinely called savages. This was a period of mass lynchings of African Americans, not only in the South, but also up north. It was a brutal time to be a black person. And so the idea of him being exhibited in a cage it's almost like a metaphor for the way in which African people, black people, were perceived.
So what drew you to this story? I mean, and how did you even first hear about Ota Benga?
Well, I'm a native New Yorker, so and a student of history, and I wanted to look at race in the 20th century, at the dawn of the 20th century, the turn of the century, in New York City. So much had been written about race in the South. I mean, we know what was happening in the South, the Ku Klux Klan and the lynchings, but very little had been written about what was happening in a place like New York City. And so when I heard about this episode, I thought it could be an interesting window into that period. There had been a book written about this incident, but it was written by the grandson of Samuel Werner, and it purported to be the story of friendship between Ota Benga and Samuel Werner.
That was his good buddy.
That was his buddy, his sidekick. So I wanted to see how you could corroborate this idea of friendship. So I went to the archives to see what he was basing that on, and what I found was so horrific that I knew the story needed to be told.
In the course of telling the story, so I'm trying to get a sense of what surprised you about the story. Did you have a sense that there was a friendship or not when you first approached it?
Something struck me from the start. Right. When's the last time your friend dropped?
Because it was clearly exploitation.
It was so clearly exploitation, and but we've heard these stories over the years about enslaved people being friends with their masters, the whole idea of Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson, this being a romance when he owned her. So like this sanitized version of history is nothing new. But what surprised me about this was that not only did Samuel Werner sanitize his relationship with Ota Benga, but for 100 years that was the definitive account. The New York Times in 1916, the year Ota Benga died, in a story on Ota Benga, said that he had never been exhibited in a cage. And Samuel Werner got to once again, define their relationship. And he had for almost 100 years the final say on what actually had transpired.
Right. So your book is essentially a corrective. I mean, this is the accurate story, and it's based on the primary documents in many cases, primary sources, and
including what Werner was writing at the time.
At the time, right?
Yeah, I mean, he was shameless. He wrote an article for the St. Louis paper on how he hunted pygmies in the Congo. Hunted. I mean, he actually wrote about this. So at the time, he did not seem to feel the need to hide what he was doing. It was only years later that the story was sanitized.
He began to understand that this wouldn't fly publicly anymore. At one time, it was quite all right.
Precisely.
I mean, I think even the Times you point out, the New York Times in an editorial described Ota Benga as a human being, quote, of a sort, close quote. Right.
No, they said according to everything that they knew, he was like a subspecies. The Times didn't understand why ministers were protesting his exhibition. And so everyone had a chance to kind of record what had happened. The Bronx Zoo, in a 1970s account, said that we can't really know what happened at this distance in time, that Ota Benga, it's unlikely he was ever exhibited in the cage. So it's everyone, from Werner to zoological officials to even the New York Times, kind of changed the whole story.
Right, they cleaned it up.
Yeah.
So give us a sense of what kind of insights you were able to draw from this story that could be applied to our understanding of race relations today.
Well, when I started working on this 5 years ago, I couldn't know that there would be this whole Black Lives Matter movement, and that some would see Ota Benga as a metaphor for black males today. I mean, he was hunted, he was caged. When we look at the mass incarceration of black men, many of them for low-level drug offenses.
In many cases, innocent people.
And even innocent people. Yeah. And I mean, and then when we see, the videotape of black men being shot in the back or, put in the chokehold, unarmed people, innocent people,
children,
killed.
In
children.
Some cases.
Tamir Rice was a child. I think you can see in that the same kind of disregard for the humanity of black people.
We've only got about a minute left, but people are always asking about a writer's writing habits. So when you're working on a book or another writing project, what's your ordinary day like?
I write every day. Well, at least 5 days a week, 9 to 5. I mean, I keep regular hours.
Can you write 9 to 5?
Pretty much. I mean, I take a break. I may take a walk.
I cannot.
I may have lunch. Oh, no. I put in the hours, and that way I can then have a life and not feel like I'm cheating. So, no, I put in the hours.
And then very briefly, do you know what your next project is?
I don't.
Well, we'll wait with bated breath.
Thank you.
Pamela Newkirk, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
We'll be back in a moment with a final word. Here's how out of whack the American economy has become. According to the Economic Policy Institute, the CEOs of the nation's 350 largest firms were paid an average of $16.3 million in 2014. Yes, that's just for 1 year's work. Now let's move toward the other end of the spectrum. And consider what's happening with young high school graduates. Only about a third of America's young people graduate from a four-year college, so holders of a high school diploma are much closer to the national norm. And those high school graduates are not doing well in this economy. Nearly 20% of high school graduates between the ages of 17 and 24 are unemployed. They're not working at all. That's 1 in 5. 37% are underemployed, which means they're working part-time but need a full-time job. And we know that a lot of those part-time jobs pay very little. This is not talked about much, but in fact, it's a national tragedy. Unemployment is a curse in a capitalist society, and our young high school graduates, who make up an enormous percentage of our young population, are saddled to an astonishing degree by that curse. The numbers don't lie. These young people are living through an economic depression, and hardly anyone's paying attention. That's all for now. See you next time.